The night was so cold it felt sharpened, as if the air itself had edges. In the remote winter fields of northern Europe, a small team of British commandos crouched at the edge of a silent minefield, their breath rising in pale ribbons. Sergeant William Harrow scanned the white crust stretching before them. Snow hid everything: the mines, the soil seams, the thin metal discs waiting for the weight of a single boot. Yet the men beside him were already unlacing their boots, fingers stiff from the frost as they prepared for a technique spoken of only in hushed corners of training camps. They stepped barefoot onto the frozen earth. The cold bit instantly, but the men kept moving, testing the ground with slow, precise pressure. Harrow felt it, a faint warmth beneath his toes, the subtle heat retained by a buried metal casing beneath the soil. One careful shift of weight, and he stepped around it. Behind him, Thomas Avery hesitated, toes trembling against the cold. His senses were fading faster than he could control. Harrow motioned for him to continue, but Avery's jaw clenched as numbness crept upward, threatening to blind the very instinct that kept them alive. The mission ahead depended on this whispered trick, a method never written down, never formally taught, and now pushed to its limit under a sky full of frozen stars. What happened next would be remembered only by the few who survived. Like and subscribe to support more stories drawn from the hidden corners of wartime history, and keep watching to discover how the night turned deadly. Long before that frozen night, the strange barefoot technique took shape far from any battlefield. In the early years of the war, British commando units were being trained for missions that required slipping through German defenses, where conventional tools often failed. Mines were evolving. Some were barely larger than a tin of biscuits, others triggered by the softest pressure. Detecting them in winter terrain became nearly impossible. Metal probes struck frozen soil with the same dull resistance as a buried charge, and detectors struggled against ice-packed ground. The men needed something else, something that let them read the land without relying on fragile equipment. During a winter exercise in the Scottish Highlands, it was Corporal Eli Marshall who first noticed the phenomenon. While crossing a training field after dusk, he stepped on a patch of ground that felt strangely warm against the cold. Moments later, an instructor revealed a dummy mine buried beneath it. Curious, Marshall tested other marked spots and felt the same faint heat. The realization spread quickly among the men. Metal buried under frozen soil held warmth differently than untouched earth. Training shifted under the radar. Small groups practiced walking barefoot at night, learning to feel minute variations in temperature, texture, and soil tension. No manual recorded it. Officers saw it as too unorthodox, too dependent on conditions that could change without warning. Still, the method lingered in the shadows of commando culture, passed from veteran to recruit with quiet warnings about frostbite, fear, and the razor-thin margin for error. The technique remained unofficial but unforgettable. As rumors of the barefoot method spread through a few isolated commando units, instructors began studying why it worked at all. The explanation was rooted not in myth, but in physics. A buried mine, especially those with steel casings used by German engineers, absorbed daytime warmth and released it slowly through the night. Even in deep winter, that slight heat lingered longer than in the surrounding frozen soil. The disturbed earth above a recently planted charge also froze unevenly, forming a crust that felt subtly different beneath sensitive skin. Tools could not register these micro-variations, but bare feet, pressed gently across the surface, could. To refine the method, small groups trained on controlled minefields. Recruits walked slowly with eyes closed, guided only by touch. They learned three key sensations: the faint warmth of metal below, the soft give of recently disturbed soil, and the brittle frost pattern often found above pressure plates. Instructors told them to move with the edges of their feet first, using the side of the toes to test the ground, then shifting weight gradually across the arch. A single rushed step could erase the sensory clues entirely. Sergeant Harrow was skeptical until he witnessed a trainee accurately map 6 buried dummy charges in near darkness without a single error. It was impressive, but dangerous. The technique demanded full sensitivity, controlled breathing, and absolute calm. Cold was the enemy, panic was worse. With the next mission scheduled in a region known for sudden freezes, the men would soon learn how quickly those advantages could turn against them. Discover what comes next. The mission that forced the Commandos to rely on the barefoot method took place in the deep winter of northern Europe, where German forces guarded a key bridge used to move ammunition and fuel toward the front. British intelligence reported that the surrounding fields had been mined only days earlier, making standard probing nearly useless. The mines were small, pressure-sensitive, and buried shallow beneath thin, newly frozen soil. Any attempt to clear them with tools risked noise, delay, or accidental detonation. The Commandos needed to cross silently, quickly, and without leaving signs of their passage. As the team reached the outer edge of the minefield, Harrow signaled for the men to remove their boots. Frost coated the ground in a thin white crust, and the temperature had dropped lower than forecast. The moment their bare feet touched the surface, they felt the shock of cold climbing up their legs. Still, the method initially worked. Harrow detected a buried mine by the mild warmth beneath his toes, shifting his weight carefully to avoid pressure. Another commando identified disturbed soil forming a subtle ring pattern in the frost. But as they advanced deeper, the cold intensified rapidly. Sensation drained from their toes, then their arches, until the nerves felt dull and slow. Even Harrow struggled to distinguish between natural frost pockets and the soft warning signs of buried charges. The men moved in near silence, breaths shallow, each step a decision made with diminishing clarity. The minefield had become a test of physiology as much as skill. The turning point came without warning. Thomas Avery, already fighting numbness, stepped onto a patch of ground that felt no different from the last dozen steps. To his frozen feet, it offered no heat, no soft give, no brittle crust, nothing at all. He shifted his weight, searching for a signal he could no longer sense. Harrow saw the hesitation, the slight tightening of Avery's jaw, and opened his mouth to whisper a warning. He was too late. The explosion was sharp and controlled, the unmistakable signature of a small pressure-triggered charge. Snow and soil burst upward in a tight column, and Avery collapsed instantly. The commando walking beside him was hurled sideways, landing with a deep gash torn across his thigh. The blast echoed across the frozen field, and within seconds German sentries shouted from the tree line. Their torches snapped to life, sweeping the darkness. Harrow dragged the wounded man into a shallow depression while the others pushed forward. The plan demanded speed, reach the bridge, plant the charges, retreat across the river before reinforcements arrived. Leaving Avery behind was not a choice, it was the only possibility. He died within moments, the cold swallowing the last of his breath. The remaining men completed the mission. They fixed explosives beneath the bridge supports, lit the fuses, and retreated into the forest as the structure collapsed behind them. During the debrief hours later, Harrow reported the route taken and the nature of the mines, but not the method used to cross them. The technique would vanish unless someone remembered why it mattered. Watch to find out how the memory survived. In the years that followed, the survivors of Harrow's team rarely spoke of the minefield crossing. When they did, it surfaced only in quiet conversations, the kind shared at regimental reunions, when the crowds thinned and the younger soldiers drifted away. The barefoot method was never written into manuals, never passed to new units, and never mentioned in the official report of the raid. It existed only as a memory, shaped by cold, fear, and the knowledge that one misjudged step could erase an entire patrol. Harrow carried the weight longest. He remembered the way the frozen ground felt beneath his feet, the thin layer of frost that hid the metal discs, and the terrible moment when Avery's senses failed him. He knew the technique had value, but also understood why it vanished. It depended on fragile, momentary conditions, ground temperature, nerve sensitivity, and weather that could change in minutes. It demanded more precision than any man could guarantee in combat. Historians later studying commando tactics of the early war years found gaps in field notes and training documents. They suspected local improvisations, odd tricks developed by small units under pressure, but nothing pointed clearly to the barefoot method. It became one of those wartime secrets that lived only in memory, too strange to formalize, too dangerous to repeat. When Harrow looked back decades later, he saw not a technique, but the thin-line men once walked, trusting their bodies against the cold and the dark, knowing that survival sometimes depended on senses that winter could steal away without warning.